In this video, we're going to discuss the conflation of Yahweh. In the Bible, the Israelites are attempting to do various different things with their Elohim that they have chosen or that they believe has been given to them, and that is Yahweh. They are attempting to elevate and conflate Yahweh in order to match the other Elohim that are around them, especially in the later times or further as we go into the Bible, when the Israelites are being conquered by the Babylonians and their theology is changing and evolving from polytheism to henotheism to being a variant of monotheism before reaching true monotheism during and after the times of Yeshua. But in the Bible, we see that Yahweh is conflated with particular deities that are of great importance to the Israelites and Canaanites, in which the Israelites are Canaanites, and various Canaanite groups such as the Israelites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Amorites, and many others. And one of the variants or one of the gods that they are using to conflate Yahweh is Baal Hadad. Now, when they are using Baal Hadad to conflate Yahweh, we see this particularly in books like the book of Job, which is one of the eldest books in the Bible, or at least one of the eldest Elohimic or Elohist books in the Bible. And we see that in the book of Job, particularly in chapter 38, verse 28, we see that they are talking about, does the rain have a father? Who is the father of the dew, right? Who is the creator of the dew? Now, Baal Hadad has at least 3 daughters. And these 3 daughters are Arse, Tale, and Pidre. And these 3 daughters, they are representative of Baal Hadad's Baal cycle, in which where he controls the weather. Now, there are many different aspects to the Baal cycle, but one of those aspects is his control of the weather and the rain and how it interacts with the soil, for example, because Arse is his daughter that would be in control of how his weather interacts with the soil. Meanwhile, Pidre would be something of like the lightning that occurs, because it gives kind of like a radiant type connotation. But then you have Tale, and that's what I'm going to focus on for this example. In Job 38, verse 28, we see that they are asking who is the father of rain, who is the father of dew, and the Hebrew that is used there is Tale, and the God or the word for God that they are using is Elohim. And this is not a coincidence. The reason why they use the words Elohim instead of Yahweh in this text is because this text was originally meant, or more than likely meant, for Baal Hadad, or even Baal Hadad and Quosh, because Quosh is also a god of hailstorms and things like that, and they mention hail later on in this same text in the book of Job. So we know that they are hinting at Baal Hadad, but they are using Yahweh as the conduit in retrospect. But this isn't the only place where they allude to conflating Baal Hadad and Yahweh, where they are taking elements of Baal Hadad and gifting it to Yahweh. We see this again in Job 38, verse 34, where they ask, who commands the clouds so that a flood of water covers you? Now, this is very significant because the word that they use for water is Yam. And this is important because Baal Hadad is one of the deities or one of the Elohim that is in conflict with the river deity or the chaotic sea deity Yam. And this is also where you see the beginning of them starting to give Yahweh the commander of clouds or the rider of clouds motif, which is strictly a Baal Hadad thing. Now, we see this again in the book of Psalms. Now, I'm going to go to the book of Psalms so that way I can read to you exactly what it says. It says, sing to God, or in this case, Elohim. And this is Psalms 68, verse 4. It says, sing to Elohim. Sing praises to his name, the one who rides the clouds. His name is Yah. Now, are we sure that his name is Yah? because I think his name might be Hadad, Baal Hadad, because Baal Hadad is strictly known as the God or the Elohim or the Elim, as it is called in Ugarit, as the rider of clouds. That is Baal Hadad's title. He is the charioteer of clouds. He is the commander of clouds. That is his domain. He is an atmospheric god, and we'll get into the cosmological inferences that these people are trying to get to when it comes to these deities. But we see that Baal Hadad is the rider of clouds, and that is what they are given to Yahweh, not just in Psalms 68 and 4, but we see this again back in the book of Job. Because in the book of Job, as I'm about to read to you, in Job 26 verse 8, it says that Elohim wraps up the waters in his clouds, yet the clouds do not burst under their own weight. This is also given another allusion to Yahweh, as the Bible is a Yahwistic book. It is trying to allude to Yahweh doing this, but they are using the words Elohim or the term Elohim because they are not specifically originally talking about Yahweh in this story. This story was probably originally attributed to another Elohim like Baal Hadad, and that is why it's saying that he is commanding or controlling the clouds and causing them not to burst. That's because he controls rainstorms. And then under their own weight, this is where you see the word Tahamatu used, because they are trying to allude to the weight of Tahamatu, who is slain by, for example, in the Babylonian variant, by Marduk, to create the foundations or the firmaments of the earth. That is what they are alluding to here, because the Israelites or the Canaanites, they share a lot of similarities and story motifs with the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, and the rest of the Mesopotamians. They share similar motifs. They share similar plot points. And this is to be expected. They were neighbors. They were neighboring nations. They were neighboring countries. And these people had very similar ideas, and they seem to have had experienced similar things, such as flooding, such as being in deserts, such as needing a rain god for those same reasons, such as needing a god of the mountains because they had mountainous regions around them. They needed a god of the sea, so they had the Apsu in the Anunnaki. They had Yam, they had Inbalulu in the Anunnaki. They had Nahadaru, you know what I'm saying? Or Yam and Nahadaru in the Elohim, to be specific. So we see that these gods are all over the area, and they are maintaining different parts of the environment, or different parts or importance to the environment or to these people's needs. And we see that Yahweh is picking up all of these different motifs. That is why he has picked up the El Shaddai motif, being the almighty mountainous God that dwells in the mountain. That was El's thing. That was Baal Hadad's thing. That was even Amudru's thing. That was other gods' thing. That was even Quosha's thing. He is even known as Deshara when you go to the Arabian Peninsula. So we see that Yahweh is absorbing these different qualities from these other gods. He is becoming an amalgamation, just as Yeshua, as Jesus is. Jesus is an amalgamation of other deities. So we see that Yahweh is taking things from gods like El and Amudru and Quosh, such as their Shaddai or their mountainous attributes. And we even see the Bible try to make concessions for this. The writers try to make concessions for this because they've woven themselves into a web that they cannot escape. Because in Genesis, they try to act as if they have known Yahweh since Genesis 4:26. They say this is when the Israelites began to call, or not the Israelites, this is when the people, this is when the Canaanites, because they are not just talking about the Israelites, they're talking about the Canaanites. These are when the Canaanite people began to call on Yahweh. So this is before the Israelites, this is before Jacob, this is before Abraham, this is before Isaac, this is before any of those people that are the patriarchs of the Israelite nation. So they are clearly talking about Canaanites or other Mesopotamians or people of the Levant, other Levantine people or people of the Arabian Peninsula. And then you see in Exodus, they try to backtrack on this. They try to say in Exodus that the Israelites, nor did any other people know Yahweh by the name Yahweh, that they knew him as El Shaddai. No, 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 no. This is the Israelites trying to save face, because we see clearly in the book of Genesis, chapter 17, 18, 19, we see that Yahweh is interacting with Abraham and Sarah, and we see further along that Yahweh is interacting even with Jacob, even with Isaac. We see that Yahweh is in the midst, even interacting with Ishmael. How is it possible that Yahweh is coming in so late to the game or changing his name when we already knew his name? He didn't have to change it. He was already known by Yahweh before he tried to adapt or amalgamate El Shaddai or Shaddai Amudru or Baal Hadad or Quosh into his attributes. So we see that in the book of Genesis, Abraham is talking to Yahweh in Genesis 17, 18, and 19. And when he sees Yahweh, Yahweh is with two other deities. Now, you can speculate on who these other deities are, and if you need proof, you can look at the Hebrew. They use the words Adonai. If they were talking about one deity, they would have used the word Adon. But even using that terminology would have been hinting towards another deity, and that deity would have been Tammuz, who would be a suspect son of Yahweh. But hinting towards Tammuz doesn't mean that it is necessarily Tammuz, because other deities could have went by Adon, but that is one of the deities that prominently went by that terminology. But we also see that Yahweh is trying to even adapt the characteristics of Tammuz. But right now we're going to focus on him adapting the El Shaddai or the Amudru attributes. So we see that in the book of Genesis, he is with these other gods. And we see that this is also an example of him adapting Baal Hadad's thunderous storm god attributes. Because when we see him in this mountainous region of Canaan, which is eventually going to be known as Bethel in that area, we see that he is doing feats that Baal Hadad would do, such as raining down hail or lightning, or even doing any type of attacks from the skies when he does these attacks on Sodom and Gomorrah. But even that story is an example of him working with two other deities, because these two other deities, because Adonai is plural, and we see that Abraham acknowledges three deities in that moment. We know that these two other deities are sent to Sodom and Gomorrah to judge it, to tell Yahweh if this place should be destroyed. So that means they have the authority to judge and condemn, just as Yahweh does, because these deities may be Baal Hadad and Quosh. It may be El and Amudru. It could have been any other deities. But all we know is that these are two other Elohim, and we see Yahweh in this mountainous region doing storm god feats. But then we see later on when Jacob goes into Edom. Now, while scholars or the people that support the Christian narrative would like to believe that Jacob is fighting Yahweh in this instance, he could have just as easily been fighting Quosh, and they are taking another narrative from the much diminished Edomite history and trying to implicate it upon Yahweh and the Israelite history. And then we also see that Yahweh is taking the El Shaddai name, which is an epithet of El, because Shaddai is used as one of his epithets, because he is El the Almighty, of the life-giving and water receiving and giving mountains. And we see that he is trying to take that attribute even all the way back in Genesis 2, where he is trying to say that he is in the garden while also being in the garden with other Elohim. But they are mentioning these rivers that give life to the people around him, that give agriculture to the people around him, because they are giving Yahweh the traits of El. Just as when later on in the Bible, Yahweh says that there are no other Els, because he is trying to compare, or the Israelites are trying to compare Yahweh with El and Dagon. Yahweh with El Elyon, the Most High God of Canaan and Ugarit, and even in places in Mesopotamia, he is trying to compare, they're trying to compare Yahweh to El Elyon and Dagon, because Dagon is also another Most High God. That is why Yahweh has beef with Dagon, even in the Bible. And you see that, well, not Yahweh. Yahweh may not have beef with any of these gods. It is really the Israelites. They have the beef. They are trying to differentiate Yahweh from the rest of the Elohim and make Yahweh significant and stand out. But Yahweh is another Elohim. He is one of them, and he is just taking attributes from them. But we'll talk about this in further detail. Comment down below on what you think.